This is a tutorial on how to create a plain basic 5/8 inch seam. So you'll be making a sample today that will be using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you'll be pressing the seam open. For the second sample, you'll do the same thing, make a 5/8 inch basic seam with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. You'll press the seam open and you'll put a zigzag finish on the very edge of the seam allowance. The first thing you'll need to do is cut out a 7 by 7 inch pattern piece. I have these printed for you, and then you'll want to hole punch it and keep it in your notebook because we will be using this basic pattern piece to create several different types of sewing skills. We'll be using our muslin fabric to cut the sample pieces, and I'm going to show you in class also how I want you to cut it because we'll need to save some of the fabric for an embroidery project we'll be doing later. Usually fabric has what's called a face on it. That's the side where you see the print or what the right side of the fabric is. So that's the right side of the fabric or the face. This is the wrong side of the fabric. And whenever you cut out patterns, you always place your fabric face to face. The muslin fabric is a plain weave and it does not have a face. Iron the fabric before cutting. Then you'll fold your fabric in half, face to face, but this is a plain weave so it looks the same on both sides. Place the pattern piece so that the grain line is parallel to the salvage edge. Pin the piece in at least 4 corners. This is just regular printing paper, so it's a little bit stiffer to pin through than regular pattern paper would be. When you cut, you want to keep your shears flat on the table. You don't lift them up, and you make nice, smooth cuts. And you'll cut around the first square. You'll get 2 pieces because we have the fabric folded. You'll need 4 altogether. After you've cut the first 2 pieces, set those aside. Then place the pattern again next to where you just cut. Again, parallel to the salvage edge, pin and cut 2 more pieces. You'll have 4 altogether. When you're finished, fold your extra fabric back up. We'll need that later. And then you should have 4 sample pieces to create the samples that you're going to work on today. Hole punch your pattern piece and put it in your notebook. Don't leave it in your tray, it will get crumpled up, so put it in your notebook, please. For the plain seam, the basic 5/8 inch seam, and also for the zigzag finish, you need to take your piece of fabric and cut it into 2 pieces so that you can create the seam line here. Take your square, fold it in half. You can put a couple pins in here to secure it. And holding that, you'll take your shears and go right along the fold so that now you've created 2 separate pieces to sew together. So you're going to do 1 more piece like that. The other 2 you're going to leave square. Don't cut them in half. Only cut 2 of them in half. You should have 2 of your squares cut in half and 2 of your squares, just leave them as a square. That's going to be for the top stitching and pivoting sample. The way that you pin fabric when you're going to create a seam, we're going to create a seam here, is you place your pins perpendicular to the seam line. So match up the edges and place a few pins down along the seam line. This will help hold the fabric in place as you're sewing it. You don't sew over the pins, you take them out before you stitch. So by having the pin in this position, it's easy to remove the pin as you're sewing. The stitch plate has lines that are 1/8 inch apart on them. You'll see there's a horizontal line going across here. The first line that crosses that is the basic 5/8 inch seam line right here. So this first line will be the 5/8, and that's where you will line up the edge of your fabric to sew. I'm lining up the edge of my fabric with the 5/8 inch seam line. I have it in about 1/4 of an inch because I need to backstitch first. So the first thing you do is lower the needle down into the fabric. I'm going to reverse stitch. When I get to the end, I let go and I go forward, lining up the edge of the fabric with 5/8 inch seam line. When I get to the pin, I remove the pin. You do not want to sew over the pin. continue before I get to that pin, remove it. Remove the pin. Go all the way to the very end. Reverse stitch about 4 stitches back. Take up levers up. Remove that out of there. I'm using black thread so you can see what I'm doing. Trim the extra thread. And then you need to press the seam open. You'll have 2 identical samples with 5/8 inch seam allowance with the back stitch on either edge. You'll take them to the ironing board. Make sure that the iron is heated up. There's a steam button here. You always press your seam open after you finish it, unless the pattern tells you something different. Pressing as you go and pressing in between each step is really important in sewing. It keeps the fabric nice and smooth and flat, and it helps hold things in place. So you'll see when you put it on the ironing board, the seams sort of stuck together like that. So first you'll do what I call what's called a finger press. You'll press the seam open with your fingers. Use the tip of the iron down the center part of the seam. Give it a little bit of steam and press that seam nice and smooth and flat. You'll do that to both samples. Woven fabric unravels, so we're going to do a zigzag finish on each of the seam allowance. We're not sewing it together, we're not sewing it to any fabric, we're just going to zigzag along this edge. Where you're going to line it up is you have to get all the fabric out of the way. You're going to line up that seam allowance edge on the inside corner of the presser foot, and you're going to put a zigzag finish right on top of that seam allowance. Please remember, when you change it to a zigzag, you need to turn this dial over to 5, so this goes over to 5. Do not change the needle position. This dial has nothing to do with zigzag, or this knob has nothing to do with zigzag. That should be in the center. To get the zigzag stitch, you turn the dial over to 5. So again, get all the fabric out of the way. We're only sewing through one layer here. You don't need to back stitch. Line up the edge of your fabric with the inside edge of the presser foot and zigzag that edge. Again, you don't need to back stitch, because when we're doing this on the pajamas or other things, we will be folding that edge under into a hem, and it will keep that in place. So go ahead and trim. Then you go to the other seam allowance, get all the fabric out of the way, line it up with the inside corner of the presser foot, put the needle down, and sew along that edge. That zigzag edge is going to make the fabric look a little puckered, so go back to the ironing board and steam and flatten your seam. The final step on the sewing skill sample is to put your name, date, and period on the skill sheet. Lay your sample right here. Staple it in each upper corner, like so. Do not paper clip, do not pin it. Do not just stick one staple in it, don't just staple it at the bottom. Staple it onto the page just like this and turn it into the tray so it can get graded.